This morning, the first of two messages from the life of Joseph, we are going to read as our text today, Genesis chapter 37, verses 1 through 28. Genesis 37, verses 1 through 28. And the title of the message today is, When You Find Yourself in a Pit. The story of Joseph plays out over a lengthy section of Genesis from chapters 37 through the end of the book, chapter 50. So we're going to read just the beginning here where Joseph first comes on the scene. Joseph, who was the great-grandson of Abraham. Genesis chapter 37, beginning in verse 1. Jacob, and this would be Joseph's father, Jacob lived in the land of his father's sojournings, in the land of Canaan. These are the generations of Jacob. Joseph, being 17 years old, was pasturing the flock with his brothers. He was a boy with the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah, his father's wives. And Joseph brought a bad report of them to their father. And by the way, that's the Bible's polite way of saying that Joseph was a tattletale. He went out and saw what his brothers were doing and went back and told Dad. And verse 3 says, now Israel, and Jacob and Israel, that's the same person. And in this chapter, you'll see this several times where it goes back and forth from calling him Jacob to his new name of Israel. So verse 3 says, now Israel loved Joseph more than any other of his sons, because he was the son of his old age. And he made him a robe, a coat of many colors. But when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peacefully to him. Now Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more. He said to them, hear this dream that I have dreamed. Behold, we were binding sheaves in the field, and behold, my sheaf arose and stood upright. And behold, your sheaves gathered around it and bowed down to my sheaf. His brother said to him, are you indeed to reign over us? Or are you indeed to rule over us? So they hated him even more for his dreams and for his words. Then he dreamed another dream and told it to his brothers and said, behold, I have dreamed another dream. Behold, the sun and the moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me. And when he told it to his father and to his brothers, his father rebuked him and said to him, what is this dream that you have dreamed? Shall I and your mother and your brothers indeed come to bow down ourselves to the ground before you? And his brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept saying in his mind. Now his brothers went to pasture their father's flock near Shechem, and Israel said to Joseph, are not your brothers pasturing the flock at Shechem? Come, I will send you to them. And he said to him, here I am. So he said to him, go now and see if it is well with your brothers and with the flock, and bring me word. So he sent him from the valley of Hebron, and he came to Shechem. And a man found him wandering in the field, and the man asked him, what are you seeking? He said, I am seeking my brothers. Tell me, please, where they are pasturing the flock. And the man said, they have gone away, for I have heard them say, let us go to Dothan. So Joseph went after his brothers and found them at Dothan. They saw him from afar, and before he came near to them, they conspired against him to kill him. They said to one another, here comes this dreamer. Come now, let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits. Then we will say that a fierce animal has devoured him, and we will see what will become of his dreams. But when Reuben heard it, he rescued him out of their hands, saying, let us not take his life. And Reuben said to them, shed no blood. Cast him into the pit here in the wilderness, but do not lay a hand on him. He said this that he might rescue him out of their hand to restore him to his father. So when Joseph came to the brothers, they stripped him of his coat of many colors. And they took him and cast him into a pit. And the pit was empty, and there was no water in it. Then they sat down to eat. And looking up, they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead, with their camels bearing gum, balm, and myrrh, on their way to carry it down to Egypt. Then Judah said to his brothers, What profit is it if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let not our hand be upon him, for he is our brother, our own flesh. And the brothers listened to him, and when the Midianite traders passed by, and they drew Joseph up and lifted him out of the pit and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver. And they took Joseph to Egypt. Some people have life verses, a verse that was given to them when they were dedicated as a baby, or maybe a verse that they claimed while they were on a spiritual retreat, and it's a verse that has come to signify their lives, a verse that they live by. I've never been able to choose a single verse. The Bible is just so rich, so full of great verses and passages. But there are certain verses, certain stories in the Bible that speak very loudly and clearly to me, and that I see my own life in. And the story of Joseph is one of those. Joseph's story is one of the great dramas of the Bible, from his pampered youth to being sold out by his brothers, to his rise in Egypt and his fall, his rise again, to the opportunity to exact revenge on his brothers, which in mercy he doesn't take advantage of, to his wisdom as one of the great patriarchs of Israel. The story is one of the great stories of the Bible. Let me give you just a very brief outline of Joseph's life. As I told you, the story plays out over quite a number of chapters. Joseph was, as a boy, favored by his parents. We know nothing of his childhood. He arrives on the scene as a 17-year-old, but we know from some of the verses that look back at his life a little bit that he was the favorite child of his father, Jacob. He was the firstborn to his mother, Rachel. Now, Jacob, Joseph's dad, had 2 wives and 2 concubines, Rachel and Leah, and then the concubines Bilhah and Zilpah. And he had children with all 4 of them. But his real love was Rachel. And Joseph was the firstborn to Rachel. Rachel only had 2 children, and she died giving birth to the second one, Benjamin. So Joseph was the firstborn to Rachel. And he, because of that, was the father's favorite. He was the mother's favorite. And because of that, his brothers hated him. Now, they conspired to kill him, the brothers did, but decided against it for fear that taking the life, shedding the blood of their own flesh and blood would bring a curse upon them. So they decided to cast him down into a dry well, a pit. And they're going to leave him there to die of thirst until a traveling caravan comes by, Ishmaelites on their way to Egypt. They decide, let's make some money off of this guy. So they do. They sell him as a slave to the Ishmaelites for 20 pieces of silver. And when Joseph gets to Egypt in the caravan, he's sold as a slave to a man named Potiphar. And Potiphar was the captain of the Pharaoh's guard, so he was an important man in Egypt. Now, under Potiphar, Joseph begins to prosper. Things are looking up for him. He becomes the most powerful of all the men underneath Potiphar, until Potiphar's wife takes an interest in Joseph. And when he spurns her advances, she tells a tall tale about Joseph, brings charges against him. And you would think, since Joseph was a slave, and this powerful woman has made very serious charges against Joseph, that he would just be executed. But you see the hand of God at work, and Joseph isn't executed, but he is thrown into prison. And while he's there, he meets a man who will play a role in his final destiny. But for now, suffice it to say that Joseph is ultimately released from prison. He goes to work for the Pharaoh, the most powerful man in the land, and he works there under Pharaoh. While Joseph is working under Pharaoh for 14 years, a great famine occurs, not in Egypt, but in Israel, where Joseph has come from. There's no more food in Israel. And Jacob sends his remaining sons, thinking all along that Joseph is dead. He sends them to Egypt to find food. And when they get there, they are at the mercy of Joseph, who is now one of the most powerful men in Egypt. But Joseph has mercy on them. And the brothers repent, and the family is reconciled. And so begins the playing out of the history of Israel that will lead ultimately to the Exodus. As I was thinking this week about Joseph's life and about you and me trying to prepare this message, I got to thinking how often it is that some of the problems we end up with in life are our own doing, and some of them are from things that are done to us. And that's exactly what happened to Joseph. Some of his problems he brought on himself, and some of the problems others gave him. Joseph was, as I said, the favorite son of Jacob and his favorite wife, Rachel. And as a young man, Joseph is just, we would say today, we call him clueless. You know, he'd show up where his brothers were. He's the kind of guy who'd show up in an Armani suit while everybody else is dressed in overalls, you know. His brothers are out in the field working, and Joseph shows up with that coat of many colors that his dad has made for him. And he never knew when to be quiet. You know, one of the things you learn with age, one of the things that comes with maturity, is you start to figure out there's some things that are just better left unsaid, right? Some things you think them and you think, yeah, I better not say that out loud. Joseph never learned that lesson, or at least not when he was early. He had dreams, and he had a gift of interpreting dreams. These were gifts that God had given him. But he never knew when to keep his mouth shut about those dreams. And so he'd go out into the field dressed in his coat of many colors while his brothers are out there working, and he'd show up and say, guess what? I had a dream. You want to know what the dream was? Not really. Well, here it was. We were all out in the field working, and I gathered my sheep, and you gathered your sheaves, and then all of a sudden my sheep stood up straight and tall and proud, and all your sheaves bowed down and started worshiping my sheep. The Bible says they hated him even more. And then he came back the next day and he said, guess what? I had another dream. In this dream, there was the sun and the moon, that's mom and dad. And then there were 11 stars, that's all of you. And you all bowed down and started worshiping me. And they hated him even more. He didn't have good sense. So he brought a lot of his problems on himself. But then some of his problems others caused for him. You read Joseph's life, and a lot of it seems unintentional, at least on his part. He's just kind of drifting along and things happen to him. This isn't Daniel throwing open his window to pray toward Jerusalem after the king of Babylon has expressly forbid this. And Daniel knows he's risking a life sentence for doing this. This isn't Abraham resolutely setting his face to leave Ur to go out to the land that God is going to show him. Joseph's just living life. You know, he's just kind of drifting along, and all of these things happen to him. There are the actions of his brothers who hate him and plot his demise, and they strip the coat of many colors from him, and they throw him into a dry well, and they leave him in the pit alone, and then change their minds and decide to sell him. There's Potiphar's wife. You know, you talk about desperate housewives. She's the original desperate housewife. She takes a fancy to Joseph, and she starts chasing him around the room. And to his credit, Joseph wants nothing to do with it. And she grabs a hold of his tunic, and he slips out of that and goes running out of the room, evidently with nothing on. You know, we live in a day and age now of selfies and Britney Spears and Lindsay Lohan. Back in those days, to run around with no clothes on was a shameful thing. It was humiliating. But even worse is that she brings charges against him and says he attacked me. It was untrue. She made false accusations against him, but they were at least partly believed, and Joseph's thrown into prison. And while he's there in prison in Egypt, he meets the Pharaoh's butler. The butler and the baker are in there. And those may sound like menial positions, but they weren't. They were positions of some influence. And they both have dreams, and they don't know what their dreams mean. And Joseph says, well, I know how to interpret dreams. And they say, well, good, here's what our dreams were. Tell us what they mean. And Joseph says, well, baker, I've got bad news for you. Your dream means you're dead. But butler, I've got good news for you. Your dream means you're gonna live. You're gonna get out of here and you're gonna prosper. And the butler says, oh man, Pharaoh's looking for a guy like you. When I get out of here, I'm gonna tell Pharaoh all about you and I'm gonna get you out of here. But he doesn't. He goes back on the promise that he made. So Joseph's problems were partly his own doing, partly what others did to him. He was ambitious, and he was unwise, and he was self-centered, but he was also the victim of the sins of others. And from the ages of 17 to 30, Joseph's life looks like a soap opera. It's one long series of up and down moments. Up before his brothers, down into the pit. Up before Potiphar, down into prison. And you're tempted to look at that story as you read it in the Bible and wonder, where is God in all of this? But the writer of Genesis lets us in on a secret. He tells us that even though Joseph doesn't realize it yet, God's covenant mercy is at work in Joseph's life all the time behind the scenes. But Joseph doesn't know it yet, and his life gets into a place where he never imagined he'd be. When you look at Joseph's life mid-story, you find this tremendously gifted man using his gifts for lesser purposes than what God intended. John Claypool, in one of his sermons on the prodigal son, said the problem with the prodigal son was at the beginning he wanted to be more than God intended. And then toward the end he tried to be less than God intended him to be. If you are not using the gifts God has given you to do what God gave you to do with them, you're never going to be at peace, because you're not being the person God intended you to be. Let me give you a personal story along these lines. Back in 1990, we were missionaries with the Foreign Mission Board. We were overseas in Argentina, and we came back on a study furlough. I had a year off to do. I was doing doctoral study and counseling at New Orleans Baptist Seminary. And as part of my work, I had to do a year of clinical internship at a mental hospital there across the lake from New Orleans. Now, this training program was used not just by our seminary, but Tulane, which is there in New Orleans, used it, LSU Medical School, which is there in New Orleans. All of their counseling and psychology students did their clinical work there. Halfway through the program, I was 6 months into it, the assistant director of the program resigned. He got a job as a director somewhere else, and he left. And to my shock, the director of the program approached me and said, we've lost our assistant director, we need to hire somebody else. It was not a lot of work outside of what I'd be doing already. He said, we'd like to offer you this position. You will continue on doing your work, but you'll get paid to do it. And basically I had to supervise some other students and things like that. And I said, I'll take it. So for 6 months I did that while I was doing my own training. I did some extra word training, and I had 1 class a week to teach and supervise some students. Well, at the end of the year, the director of the program resigned. And I was just finishing. We were scheduled to go back to Argentina within the month. And to my shock, the director of the program recommended me as his replacement. And the hospital officials came and talked to me and said, "We like the work you're doing. You've had good reviews all the way through. The director has recommended you for this position. We want to offer you the job." And I took it. Now, we were scheduled to go back to Argentina, like I said, within a month, and I had no idea how I was going to explain this to the people in Argentina. Wasn't sure how I was going to explain it to the Lord. Lord had called us to go there, but this opportunity all of a sudden came up, and I thought, this is tremendous. And in my mind, I was thinking of all the different ways this would be good. I'd still be doing the Lord's work, but not exactly the way I thought I'd be doing it. And, I'm thinking all of those things. And for 2 weeks, I was the most miserable human being on the planet. Because I was using my gifts in a way that God had never intended. God had something else for me to be doing, and I knew that. I just got sidetracked briefly. And after 2 weeks, I went into the office of the hospital administrator and took my little badge off and said, "I quit." He said, "Why?" And I said, "This is not what God wants me to be doing. We're supposed to be back in Argentina." And we did. Now, that was Joseph. Take this gift of dream interpretation that God had given him. Joseph's dreams would ultimately save an empire and would lead to the unfolding of salvation history in Israel. And here he is, using his gift to interpret the dreams of some low-level bureaucrats in the county jail. Or take the gift of administration. Joseph was a gifted administrator. He rose quickly under Potiphar. He rose quickly under the Pharaoh, on both occasions becoming the most powerful underling to both of those men. He ran what would be the equivalent of FEMA there in Egypt for 14 years, the disaster relief program. And yet, when we find in mid-story, he's stuck there in prison depending upon the mercy of others to help him. And you read that and you shake your head and you think, oh, how the mighty have fallen. I was reading the testimony this week of a man, a Christian man, who talked about his own life of going from the top to being wealthy, living in a mansion, famous, to losing everything and having nothing. Lost his family, lost his fortune. And he said the low point came when he moved into his little one-room apartment, unfurnished, and he had to buy furniture. But he couldn't afford furniture. So he had to buy used furniture. And he said he went down to the used furniture store, and this was new to him. He didn't know how these places operate. He was used to picking out whatever he wanted and just writing a check for it. He goes down to the used furniture store, and they only take cash, no credit. And whatever you buy on cash, you can make payments on it, but you have to pay every week, not once a month. And he said the clerk stood there with him and looked out at the used furniture there in the store, and he said, why don't we just dance through here and see what you like? And the guy said, man, I didn't feel like dancing. I felt like crawling through there. But this man's testimony was that he later came to see, he didn't know it at the moment, but he later came to see that even in that moment, God was at work. And that's what Joseph came to learn. You see, that's at the heart of it. That's what the story of Joseph is all about. That behind the scenes, God never stopped working in Joseph's life. And what the story of Joseph teaches us is that even when we don't see it, Even when life turns out in ways that we neither expected nor wanted, even when we suffer from things we did to ourselves or from things that others have done to us, even when we get thrown down into a prison or into a pit that seems to have no exit, God is invisibly and intentionally and actively at work behind the scenes. Remember when Joseph gets thrown into the prison? I can imagine that an intelligent man like Joseph was probably working on a plan to get out of that prison. He might have been thinking, maybe I can dig a tunnel and dig my way out of here. Or maybe I could tie some sheets together and climb out the window. Because what he wanted was to get out of prison and get back home. But God didn't want him out of prison, at least not yet. He still had to meet Pharaoh's butler. And God didn't want him back in Israel. He wanted him in Egypt. And so God worked in spite of Joseph and in spite of what Joseph wanted to secure his future. Remember when Joseph got thrown down into that pit where his brothers put him? You ever notice that when you are in a pit in your life, when you get down in a pit, you ever notice you get a lot of advice in those moments, right? You'll have an optimist come by and look into that pit and say, oh, that pit's not so bad. Or a pessimist will come by and look into that pit and say, nobody ever gets out of a pit like that. I'm so glad that Jesus came. And when he came, he didn't just look into my pit. He didn't tell me how to get out of the pit. He got in there with me, and he lifted me up and out. Joseph's brothers left him for dead in that pit. And he looked around that pit and he thought to himself, I'm in here all alone. But he wasn't. Because the Lord was in there with him. And the Lord had big plans for Joseph. Joseph's brothers never knew that God could use their anger and their jealousy to accomplish his will. Potiphar's wife never imagined that her wandering eye would lead Joseph straight to his destiny. And Joseph didn't know it yet. Not only was the Lord in the pit with him, but also in the pit with him was one of his as yet unborn descendants, a baby named Moses. And unless Joseph got out of that pit and got to Egypt, Moses would never lead the children of Israel out of bondage in Egypt and into the promised land. That caravan of Ishmaelites didn't know that stamped into Joseph's DNA was a young man still hundreds of years in the future named Joshua, who would be the one who would lead the freed children of Israel from the wilderness into the promised land. The jailer who turned the key on Joseph's cell didn't know that locked inside his cell was a man who carried in his genes a king named David, whose lineage would produce the Messiah named Jesus. That jailer never knew that he held the keys that unlocked God's redemptive plan for the world. We never know what God is up to. But I know this: God never sleeps. He never slumbers. He is always actively at work. He never stops working in our lives. Now, you may be down in a pit today, and you may be thinking that you are in there all alone, but you're not. All around you, God is using events and people to accomplish his will in your life, and you'll never even know he's doing it until you see the final outcome. And in spite of the difficulties that we create for ourselves or that others create for us, God is actively, intentionally, and invisibly working in our lives. And so when you find yourself in a pit, look around. And remember this, you are not in there alone. This morning we're going to sing as our song of invitation, hymn number 342, Rock of Ages. Let's stand together now.